All right. Thank you very much, Avner and Jim, for organizing this conference for a quarter of a century and also for inviting me to discuss this paper that I found fascinating. So let me start by basically reviewing the basic building blocks or the logic and the main results of the paper. So Martin and co-authors start by documenting quite convincingly that there is a common ownership of competitor firms. So those are firms that operate in the same industry and might compete in product markets. The next step is to say that this common ownership might lead to changes in firms' corporate governance. With the idea that common investors may want to influence product market strategies or other strategies of firms they own. There is not much evidence about that, but there is some anecdotal evidence that Martin provides. Now, the idea of changing corporate governance is to change firms' objective functions. And those objective functions might lead to changes in firm strategies, different types of strategies, in particular pricing strategies, so changes in prices of products that firms supply. So I think this is a thought-provoking paper, so it should provoke thoughts not only among academics, but also among policymakers and regulators. I think the results are quite intriguing. I'm going to have some comments about them, but I think they're very interesting. I think the paper contributes to multiple strands of literature, the literature on common ownership, on institutional investors and corporate governance, and also for people interested in the specifics of airline industry. It tells something about how the pricing works there. Now, it seems like the tip of the iceberg is the common theme of this session. So I think the results in this paper is just the tip of the iceberg. And there's a lot of potential for future research related to this one that could be done. And I'm going to talk about this potential in the next few minutes. All right, so let me start with the second building block of this flow chart that I wrote down, because the first one I think is quite convincing. There is common ownership, and it's quite pervasive. So how do block holders affect corporate governance? Well, there are two ways. The first one is the direct channel. They can basically vote. Then there is a big literature on lending, on vote lending, around voting. The conclusion from this literature is that there are generally spikes of lending of shares around record dates. So dates that are recorded for voting purposes, but there are no spikes in price of stock lending, right? So you would think that if stock lending would be really important, you would see spikes in the price of lending. So it seems like institutional investors seem unlikely to use this direct channel on average to influence firm strategies. And that's also what those people say, right? So there are some quotes from BlackRock and Vanguard here. They basically say that most of the influences does not come from voting. So then there's the indirect channel, right? That is the behind-the-scene communication between the owners and the portfolio firms. And there are also some quotes from surveys and from BlackRock and Vanguard that should suggest that this is probably the likely channel how firms would affect decision-making in the firm, right? So institutional investors seem likely to use the indirect channel to influence firms' strategies, right? Now, the question is what types of strategies they are going to be likely to influence using this indirect channel. Well, in general, that could be any strategy of the firm that has externalities for other firms in the portfolio or for other firms in the industry. And I'm just listing a few here. So capital investment obviously has negative implications for firms competing in the same industry. M&As and capital structure can have different impacts depending on what are the reasons for M&As or what are the reasons for choosing a particular level of leverage. Executive compensation or relative performance evaluation in particular can have impact on portfolio firms as well. Now, the authors here choose to focus on pricing, which to me does not seem like the first place to look at when you want to examine the influence of investors on firms. But the reason that they do it is that their interviews with pricing managers suggest that they're well aware of competitors' owners, which inform route-level pricing strategies. Now, it seems difficult to assume that pricing manager would know exactly the ownership structure of all firms, in the industry, and adjust all, route level prices accordingly. Right. So what I would really like to see here to kind of justify this this assumption is some sort of analysis of their compensation schemes. Right. So how are they rewarded? Are they is their compensation increasing in the profits of competitive firm? If this is the case, then this assumption, I think, is going to be more believable. All right, so I think it's going to be really interesting to examine other strategies. So the effect of this common ownership of other strategies that firms take, that are listed on the previous slide. Now, what Martin will say is that the big advantage of using pricing as opposed to other strategies is that we have this market level heterogeneity in delta MHHI, so levels of common ownership. But what you could do here is you can use firm level heterogeneity in delta MHHI, right? There are many carriers. All of those are exposed to different levels of common ownership. So that could be used to, as an identification for, the effects of common ownership of other firm strategies. All right, now let me get to the main finding of the paper, the effect on prices, and I'm going to play a role of a devil's advocate here for a few minutes, not because I really believe the story that I'm going to tell, but I think that the authors need to make sure to rule it out. All right, so what is the basic analysis? I'm going to focus on the second part of the analysis, the diff and diff, because I think that's a better type of identification. So here's how it goes. They compare prices, route level prices, in years 2011 and 13 relative to prices in 2009. So that's after the acquisition of Barclays by BlackRock relative to prices before acquisitions. And the second part of the diff and diff is that we look at different markets, so markets with high and low merger-induced changes in this delta MHHI. Right? And the main result is that the change in prices following this acquisition is higher in markets in which the change in this delta MHHI is higher, and also there is a result about quantities. So the change in quantity is lower in those markets. Right? Now, a potential issue is that this acquisition of Barclays by BlackRock did not happen in a vacuum. Right? It happened during a financial crisis. And so it could be that the demand for air travel would be higher following the crisis, after the crisis, than during the crisis. Right? Now, the argument for diff and diff is that this methodology is used precisely to answer this question of temporal shocks to the whole market. Right? Now, in an example that I'm going to give you, I'm not entirely convinced that that this methodology completely accounts for those temporal changes. So let's consider two industries. One is a concentrated industry, and the other is a competitive one. Right? So the concentrated one is on the left, and the competitive one is on the right, and those are kind of your typical graphs of demand and supply. And what happens is that in both cases, the demand basically moves to the right. Right? So after the crisis, the demand is higher. So in the competitive industry, there are more firms. So when you aggregate the supply, the supply becomes more flat. Right? And so what's going to happen is that in the more concentrated industry, in which there is potentially a lower number of firms and higher Herfindahl index, there is going to be a higher effect on prices and lower effect on quantities than in the competitive industry, in which there is high number of firms and low Herfindahl index. Okay? Now, why do I mention this? Well, I mention this because there is a possibility that the Herfindahl index or the structure of the industry in general is correlated to this delta MHHI or change in it. Right? Why might it be correlated? Because both are driven by the number of firms operated in the industry. Right? So the first thing I did to see whether this conjecture is right or not, I looked at the graph that Martin presented of the evolution of HHI and delta MHHI over time. So I didn't have the actual numbers, so I had to eyeball the numbers from the graph. But the correlation that I got there is 0.68, so pretty high. Now, what we're really interested in, though, is not the time series correlation, but the cross-sectional correlation, across different markets. Right? Let me start by giving you a very small example. So let's say that we have an industry with two firms, right, with the same market shares. Thank you. And they have four owners that have some common holdings, right? And I can compute the Herfindahl index, that's trivially 1/2. I can also compute, the delta MHHI, which is another 0.46, right? And what I can also do, I can assume that two of those owners merge. So for example, owners 1 and 3, and I can compute the change in delta MHHI that in this example happens to be 0.026. Now let's look at a different industry with 3 firms, right? So I'm just adding one firm without any ownership by those existing owners. And I also compute all of those numbers, right? So I can see that the Herfindahl index is lower, also the delta MHHI is lower, and the change in the delta MHHI caused by the merger is also lower, right? So in this example, it seems to be that the correlation between the Herfindahl index and the delta MHHI is indeed positive. Now, to convince you that this is not some convoluted example that I constructed, the right thing to do would just to compute the correlation in the data, right? I don't have the data, so I try to do the next best thing, and I try to simulate something that might resemble the data a little bit. So here's how the simulation goes. It's really simple, right? I'm not pretending that those numbers that I'm going to get are the real ones, but they might be a cause for some concern. So what it is the following. So I assume that there is some number of firms in industry, so it varies between 2 and 7. The number of owners varies between 1 and 10. Market shares are random. Cash flow rights are also random. Control rights equal to the voting rights, and all of those variables are independent, between each other. And then I can compute the Herfindahl index and also this delta MHHI, and they repeat this 10,000 times and compute the correlations between those numbers, right? So here are the results. So the correlation in this particular simulation between HHI and delta MHHI is 79%. And all of that correlation is driven by the fact that that both of those numbers are negatively correlated to the number of firms in industry, and this negative correlation is also very high, right? Now again, I'm not saying that those numbers are correct, but this is something to check. Now the implication of this is that this delta MHHI and change in it may proxy for the industry structure, right? And so the diff and diff result may just indicate that prices in markets that are more concentrated increase more or are more sensitive to the business cycle, right? So they increase more when the economic conditions improve. If this is the case, there are some possible solutions to this. So at the minimum, I think the author should just orthogonalize this delta MHHI and the changes with respect to the industry structure. Or I think a better solution would be to basically match industries on industry structure to begin with, and then perform the analysis that would basically eliminate the concern. A couple of other comments. So I come back to these links that are in the paper. There is one link that is missing here, or that this chain could be extended, and that is that it could be extended to firm values, right? Now, obviously, if there are changes to the firm's pricing strategies, that could have implications for firm values as well. There is a big literature in mergers that looks at implications of mergers and acquisitions on firm-owned values, values of competitor firms, and also values of along the supply chain, so corporate customers and suppliers. I think this is a place where this same logic could be applied, right? So this analysis from the merger literature could be applied here. I think this could be a pretty fruitful avenue for future research. A couple of smaller comments. So the whole logic of the paper, as Martin presents it, hinges on on block owners, right, that own something like 70 or 80% shares in public U.S. firms, right? And the assumption is that firms maximize the weighted average of those owners' interest. Now, in the case that the firm is owned by small, perfectly diversified shareholders, you also get this, MHHI of around 1, right? And Martin also says this in the appendix, right? Now, the idea is that large blockholders are probably more able to influence the decisions of the firm than small ones, but still, I think the premise of the paper should be that common ownership affects firm strategies, not necessarily common ownership by large blockholders. And a final thought, I think the authors a little bit overstate the economic importance of their results. So I'm just quoting here. Anti-competitive incentives implied by common ownership concentration are more than 10 times larger than what the FTC or Department of Justice merger guidelines presume to enhance market power. Now, this comparison here is between levels and changes, right? So levels of delta MHHI and changes in Herfindahl index that the Department of Justice finds worrisome, right? Now, when you compare actual changes and changes, the results are significant and important, but a little bit smaller, right? So I'm again quoting from the paper, the mean and median implied change in delta MHI following the merger between BlackRock and Barclays is 91 HHI points. And the largest applied increase is 281 HHI points, and that's compared to the 200 points that is the threshold that are used by those agents, right? So I think just rephrasing some of the economic magnitudes I think should help here, right? But overall, I think this is a great paper, and I think it opens avenues for a lot of related important research. Thank you.